This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're breaking with convention.
What they're doing is using COVID to steal an election.
Right.
They're using COVID to defraud the American people, all of our people, of a fair and free election. And we can't do that.
The Republican National Convention begins in Charlotte, North Carolina, with President Trump claiming Democrats can only defeat him by stealing the election. Then, in prime time, Republicans repeatedly use apocalyptic language to describe what a Biden presidency would look like.
They want to steal your liberty, your freedom. They want to control what you see and think and believe so that they can control how you live.
We'll hear excerpts from the Republican National Convention, then speak to longtime Republican strategist Stuart Stevens, who's worked on 5 Republican presidential campaigns. His new book, It Was All a Lie: How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump. Plus, we look at an issue overlooked at the Republican National Convention, climate. The climate-fueled wildfires engulfing California, where crews are currently battling 625 fires that have killed at least 7 people. We'll speak with a formerly incarcerated firefighter. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. The Republican National Convention opened in Charlotte, North Carolina, with dire warnings from President Trump and his backers that a Joe Biden presidency could destroy the country. Trump began the convention claiming without any evidence Democrats are trying to steal the election.
The only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election.
Little attention was paid on the opening day of the Republican National Convention to the over 177,000 Americans who've died during the COVID-19 pandemic, or the tens of millions of workers who've lost their jobs. While Trump was repeatedly praised by the speakers during the convention, dissent is growing within the Republican Party. On Monday, former Senator Jeff Flake joined with over 24 other former Republican Congress members to launch a new group, Republicans for Biden. We'll have more on the RNC after headlines. A warning to our viewers. This next story contains disturbing images of police violence. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers called in the National Guard Monday as protests continued in Kenosha for a second night following the police shooting on Sunday of Jacob Blake, an unarmed 29-year-old black man. An officer shot Blake 7 times in the back as he was getting into his car. His 3 children, aged 3, 5, and 8, witnessed the shooting from the car. Blake was reportedly trying to break up a fight between 2 women before the shooting, but the police have not explained why they went after him or shot him. He remains hospitalized in serious but stable condition. Protesters defied a curfew Monday night as police used tear gas on crowds. Protests also took place across the country, including here in New York City. Governor Evers and Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes called state lawmakers into a special session to take up legislation on police brutality that was introduced earlier this year. This is Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes.
This was not an accident. This wasn't bad police work. This felt like some sort of vendetta being taken out on a member of our community. The officer's deadly actions attempted to take a person's life in broad daylight. And like many of you, the video is etched into my mind, like so many other past videos that are just like it. It was a video that I would have rather not had to have watched. But the irony isn't lost on me that as Jacob Blake was actually trying to de-escalate a situation in his community, but the responding officer didn't feel the need to do the same.
Food and Drug Administration Commissioner Stephen Hahn admitted Monday he overstated the positive results of using blood plasma from recovered patients as a treatment for COVID-19. He denied politics played a role in the FDA's emergency use authorization of the treatment, which was touted by President Trump on Sunday. Earlier, President Trump had said the FDA is part of the deep state. In education news, a Florida judge blocked a state order requiring schools to offer in-person teaching, saying it failed to take safety concerns into account. Florida's appealed the ruling. Ohio State University has suspended 228 students from campus for breaking rules around parties and gatherings. Meanwhile, the University of North Carolina reported a 31% COVID-19 positivity rate for last week, up from 13% the first week of class. In environmental news related to the coronavirus, the Associated Press found thousands of oil and gas projects and government facilities have been permitted to stop monitoring for hazardous emissions and bypass other environmental and health rules during the pandemic. In international news, scientists in Hong Kong say they've identified their first case of reinfection after a recovered COVID-19 patient contracted the virus again 4.5 months after his first infection. Meanwhile, in Xinjiang, China, reports have emerged of people being handcuffed to buildings and being ordered to stay inside for weeks on end as part of the repressive measures taken to contain the coronavirus, despite official numbers going down. China has been accused of demographic genocide in Xinjiang for its mass imprisonment and repression of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. Gaza has gone into lockdown after it reported its first COVID-19 cases outside a quarantined area. The 4 cases were from the same family in a refugee camp. Doctors in eastern Libya are warning that overburdened and poorly equipped hospitals will not be able to handle the rising number of coronavirus patients. Protesters have taken to the streets of Tripoli and Misrata in recent days to demand an end to corruption and proper care for those affected by the pandemic. In California, the death toll has risen to at least 7 as climate change-fueled wildfires continue raging across the state. Governor Gavin Newsom said Monday close to 300 lightning strikes overnight had sparked 10 new fires, bringing the number of active fires to 625. Over 1.4 million acres have burned across California. Authorities say some progress has been made over the past day, though, and the biggest group of fires around Napa in Northern California is now 25% contained. Among the tens of thousands of firefighters who have been enlisted to fight the blazes are around 1,300 incarcerated people. Later in the broadcast, we'll hear from a formerly incarcerated firefighter in California. Postmaster General Louis DeJoy was grilled by Democrats Monday as he testified before the House Oversight Committee about recent changes at the U.S. Postal Service. DeJoy struggled to answer basic questions, including about mail-in voting during the 2016 elections and the cost of mail. He also refused to provide justification for recent changes at the Postal Service, which has led to a slowing down of delivery times and has prompted fears Trump is deliberately trying to sabotage the U.S. Postal Service in the run-up to the elections. In related tech news, Twitter flagged a Trump tweet that claimed mailboxes are a, quote, voter security disaster and not COVID sanitized. Twitter said the tweet made, quote, misleading health claims that could potentially dissuade people from participation in voting. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reassured Israel Monday the U.S. will ensure it retains its military advantage in the Middle East under any future arms deals with the United Arab Emirates. The remarks come as questions swirl over possible U.S. plans to sell F-35 jets to the UAE following the normalization agreement it reached with Israel earlier this month. On Sunday, White House senior advisor, presidential son-in-law Jared Kushner, said the deal should increase the probability of such a sale. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has come under fire over reports last week that the sale of F-35s was part of the deal with the UAE and that he gave Trump the green light for the sale. Netanyahu has denied the reports. The UAE reportedly canceled a planned meeting with the U.S. and Israel over his denial. Israel's the only country in the Middle East that currently has the F-35. Secretary of State Pompeo will deliver a speech tonight at the Republican National Convention, a move which critics say is a violation of the Hatch Act since he's a diplomat. The speech was recorded Monday in Israel, which is continuing its bombing assault on Gaza. In Bangladesh, at least 160 people have been killed and millions forced to flee their homes as residents grapple with ongoing flooding after weeks of torrential rains. At least one-third of the country has been submerged by floods. This comes as Bangladesh's COVID-19 cases near 300,000, and local officials warn of the joint devastating impact of the pandemic and the floods. This is a resident affected by those floods.
We are suffering a lot from the floods that have been going on for 2 months. We can't move. We can't go anywhere to buy food. There's no school for the children.
In Britain, refugee rights activists are sounding the alarm over the ongoing detention of unaccompanied children who arrive on boats through the English Channel. The children are reportedly being held at a facility that for months warned the British government it did not have the resources to safely house the rising number of young asylum seekers. Activists say British immigration officials are breaking the law, which prohibits the government from detaining unaccompanied children for longer than 24 hours. Last week, the body of a young man from Sudan washed up on a beach after he drowned while attempting to cross from France to England through the English Channel. Activists say anti-refugee policies have denied asylum seekers safe and legal routes to Britain. Back in the United States and North Carolina, a federal appeals court has ruled the rights of Ronnie Long, a black man who's been in prison for over 40 years, were violated during his trial. Long was convicted for the rape of a white woman in 1976 by an all-white jury. But he's maintained for decades he was wrongfully convicted. 3 appeals court judges said Monday they too believe Long is innocent, citing what they call, quote, extreme and continuous police misconduct in his case. The appeals court is now urging a lower court to close the case. Long was 20 years old at the time of his arrest. He's now 64. The Office of New York Attorney General Letitia James is investigating the Trump Organization and President Trump over the possible inflating of his assets in order to secure loans and other benefits. James is requesting President Trump's son Eric be compelled to testify after he abruptly canceled a planned deposition last month. In 2019, Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, told Congress Trump had inflated his assets and financial statements to obtain loans while deflating the value of other assets to reduce real estate taxes. TikTok is suing President Trump over his executive order banning the popular video sharing app. TikTok, which is owned by the company ByteDance, said Trump's order was part of a, quote, broader campaign of anti-China rhetoric. Trump also banned the Chinese social media app WeChat earlier this month. TikTok has around 92 million monthly users in the United States. And Jerry Falwell, Jr., has reportedly resigned as president of the Evangelical Christian Liberty University in Virginia amidst the growing fallout over claims about his personal life. He was put on leave earlier this month after he posted a photo on Instagram in which he's posing with his arm around a young woman holding a drink with his pants unzipped. On Monday, Giancarlo Granda, a former hotel pool attendant who then became a business partner, said he had an affair with Becky Falwell, Jerry Falwell Jr.'s wife. Granda says Falwell Jr. would watch while they had sex. Jerry Falwell Jr. is a prominent supporter of President Trump, surprising many in 2016 when he endorsed Donald Trump. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We're breaking with convention. I'm in New York City, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez from his home in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, the Republican National Convention opened in Charlotte, North Carolina Monday. President Trump made a surprise speech during the day. Just minutes after he was formally nominated for a second term, he spoke in front of a group of delegates in Charlotte.
4 more years! 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 4 more years!
Now, if you want to really drive him crazy, you say 12 more years. Because we caught them doing some really bad things in 2016. Let's see what happens.
During his daytime speech, President Trump continued his attack on mail-in voting.
And the only way they can take this election away from us is if this is a rigged election. We're going to win this election. What they're doing is using COVID to steal an election. They're using COVID to defraud the American people, all of our people, of a fair and free election. And we can't do that.
While Trump spoke in Charlotte, the new Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, who is a major Trump donor, was being grilled by Democrats on the House Oversight Committee who accused him of trying to sabotage the Postal Service ahead of the election. In an unusual decision, the Republican Party has decided not to adopt a new platform this year, a move that ensures there will be no public debate at the convention about the direction of the party under Trump. During the primetime Republican National Convention, speakers, including the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., use apocalyptic language to describe the dangers of a Biden presidency. The evening kicked off with Charlie Kirk, founder of the right-wing student group Turning Point.
We may not have realized it at the time, but Trump is the bodyguard of Western civilization. Trump was elected to protect our families from the vengeful mob that seeks to destroy our way of life, our neighborhoods, schools, churches, and values. President Trump was elected to defend the American way of life.
Throughout the first night of the Republican convention, speakers repeatedly praised Trump's handling of the COVID-19 outbreak, even as the U.S. death toll tops 177,000. By far the highest in the world. The U.S. has less than 5% of the world's population, but more than 25% of the deaths. No mention was made of Trump's record of spreading misinformation, his urging of states to reopen too soon, or his months-long refusal to wear a mask during the pandemic. This is Amy Ford, a nurse from West Virginia.
President Trump recognized the threat this virus presented for all Americans early on and made rapid policy changes. And as a result, telehealth services are now accessible to more than 71 million Americans, including 35 million children.
There continues to be a lack of tests and masks available to the overall population in the United States. While polls show 90% of black voters back the Biden-Harris ticket, a number of African-American public figures were featured on Monday night's Republican convention, including Vernon Jones, a Democratic state representative from Georgia.
I'm here to tell you that black voices are becoming more woke and louder than ever. The Democratic Party has become infected with a pandemic of intolerance, bigotry, socialism, anti-law enforcement.
The wealthy white St. Louis couple who brandished guns at Black Lives Matter protesters who marched near their mansion in June also spoke. Mark and Patricia McCloskey now face felony charges over the incident, which saw Mark McCloskey point a semi-automatic assault rifle at protesters while Patricia waved a silver pistol, her finger on the trigger.
This all happened to us could just as easily happen to any of you who are watching from quiet neighborhoods around our country. And that's what we want to speak to you about tonight.
That's exactly right. Whether it's the defunding of police, ending cash bail so criminals can be released back out on the streets the same day to riot again, or encouraging anarchy and chaos on our streets. It seems as if the Democrats no longer view the government's job as protecting honest citizens from criminals, but rather protecting criminals from honest citizens. Not a single person in the out-of-control mob you saw at our house was charged with a crime. But you know who was? We were.
They're not satisfied with spreading the chaos and violence into our communities. They want to abolish the suburbs altogether.
Black Lives Matter protesters were passing the McCloskeys' house to get to the mayor's house in protest when the McCloskeys brandished their weapons at the protesters. Many speakers on the opening night of the Republican National Convention warned of chaos if Trump loses the race. This is former Fox News host Kimberly Guilfoyle.
They want to destroy this country and everything that we have fought for and hold dear. They want to steal your liberty, your freedom. They want to control what you see and think and believe so that they can control how you live. They want to enslave you to the weak, dependent, liberal, victim ideology to the point that you will not recognize this country or yourself.
Kimberly Guilfoyle is the partner of Donald Trump Jr., who spoke next. She's also the ex-wife of the California governor, Gavin Newsom. She also took aim at California. But Donald Trump Jr. also then addressed the convention.
People of faith are under attack. You're not allowed to go to church, but mass chaos in the streets gets a pass. It's almost like this election is shaping up to be church, work, and school versus rioting, looting, and vandalism. Or, in the words of Biden and the Democrats, peaceful protesting. Anarchists have been flooding our streets, and Democrat mayors are ordering the police to stand down. Small businesses across America, many of them minority-owned, are being torched by mobs. The Democrat mayors pretend it's not happening. They actually called it a summer of love.
Former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, who's widely viewed as a potential presidential candidate in 2024, also spoke.
In much of the Democratic Party, it's now fashionable to say that America is racist. That is a lie. America is not a racist country. This is personal for me. I am the proud daughter of Indian immigrants. They came to America and settled in a small southern town. My father wore a turban. My mother wore a sari. I was a brown girl in a black and white world. We faced discrimination and hardship, but my parents never gave in to grievance and hate.
The opening night of the Republican National Convention ended with Senator Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the U.S. Senate. He claimed Joe Biden wants a cultural revolution in the United States.
Our side is working on policy, while Joe Biden's radical Democrats are trying to permanently transform what it means to be an American. Make no mistake. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris want a cultural revolution, a fundamentally different America. If we let them, they will turn our country into a socialist utopia. And history has taught us that path only leads to pain and misery, especially for hardworking people hoping to rise.
Senator Tim Scott speaking at the opening of the Republican National Convention. When we come back, we'll speak to veteran Republican strategist Stuart Stevens, author of the new book, It Was All a Lie, How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump. Stay with us.
I keep going round and round on the same old circuit. A wire travels underground to a vacant lot, where something I can't see interrupts the current and shrinks the picture down to a tiny dot. And from behind the screen it can look so perfect, but it's not. So here I'm sitting in my car at the same old stoplight,
It's Not by Amy Mann. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. As the Republican National Convention kicked off Monday, the Republican Party announced it would not adopt a new platform and instead pledged its support to President Donald Trump. At the same time, a group of veteran Republican operatives who want to defeat Trump launched a $4 million advertising blitz this week that targets voters in swing states.
Morning in America. Today, more than 175,000 Americans have died from a deadly virus Donald Trump ignored, praising China's response instead of heeding the warnings, then blaming them to cover his own failures. With the economy in shambles, more than 30 million Americans are out of work, the worst economy in decades. This afternoon, millions of Americans will apply for unemployment, and with their savings run out, many are giving up hope. Millions worry that a loved one won't survive COVID-19. There's mourning in America, and under the leadership of Donald Trump, our country is weaker and sicker and poorer. And now, Americans are asking, if we have another 4 years like this, will there even be an America?
The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
That ad called Morning in America, spelled M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. The anti-Trump ads will run on TV and online throughout this week's convention coverage and are paid for by the Lincoln Project, a super PAC that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money. On Monday, former Republican National Committee Chair Michael Steele announced he's joining the group. This comes as longtime White House advisor Kellyanne Conway said she plans to leave her job at the end of this month, citing her family. And her husband, George Conway, who co-founded the Lincoln Project, is also leaving the Lincoln Project. The couple's 15-year-old daughter, Claudia Conway, had said she's seeking emancipation from her parents and tweeted she's devastated her mother is speaking at the Republican National Convention. Conway replied, talking about stepping back from her job as a top senior advisor and counsel to the president. From now on, less drama, more mama. Meanwhile, the pro-Biden super PAC, American Bridge, launched an ad campaign Monday that features Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen. For more, we're joined by someone who is a senior advisor to the Lincoln Project and much more. Stuart Stevens is a longtime Republican political consultant who worked as a strategist for 5 Republican presidential campaigns, including Bob Dole, George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, as well as senators, congressmen, and governors. Politico calls him one of the most successful political operatives of his generation. Stevens did not support Donald Trump as the Republican candidate in 2016. His new book is out this month. It's titled, "It Was All a Lie: How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump." In it, he compares his lifelong political party to the mafia, the segregationist movement, and even to the Nazis. Stuart Stevens, welcome to Democracy Now! Thank you for joining us from your home in Stowe, Vermont. You have said that race and racism is at the core of the Republican project. Can you talk about why you feel it's not just Donald Trump? I mean, many, even in the Lincoln Project, say their party left them. But you are saying that the original sin of the Republican Party, racism, is at its core. It's not just Donald Trump. Please explain.
First, great to be here. It really goes back, and in this book I wanted to trace this, to the post-World War II history of the modern Republican Party. 1956, Dwight Eisenhower got almost 40% of the African-American vote. That fell off a cliff with Barry Goldwater in 1964. He got 7%. He opposed the Civil Rights Act. Now, you could have made a case at the time that African Americans would drift back to the Republican Party in some substantial numbers because of cultural conservatism, faith, entrepreneurship, patriotism, but that never happened. So since 1964, the Republican Party has failed to attract African Americans in any numbers over 10% in most races. And what does that mean? It means really that you get very good at one thing and not very good at the other. Now, I was part of the party that worked for George Bush, both George Bushes actually, but I went down in April of 99 to work for Governor Bush. And we saw that the party needed to change. We tried to form a new formulation of conservatism that the governor called compassionate conservatism. Our feeling was, at least my feeling was, and I think others agreed with me, that we were almost inevitable, that the side of the party that we represented would emerge as dominant. I think looking at Donald Trump, I have to admit I was wrong. I think that we were the recessive gene, not the dominant gene, and that the party now has become very comfortable with a white grievance. And I think you saw that on full display last night.
Well, Stuart Stevens, following up on that, in your book, you have a chapter, I think it's chapter 8, The Empire's Last Stand. And you say in there the Trump obsession with immigrants from Mexico and Central America is motivated by his own racism, but it also reflects the knowledge that every new non-white voter in America is a threat to the existence of the Republican Party. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, that's just a fact. But if you look at the construct of the Republican Party now, the great danger, and the reason the Republican Party, if it doesn't change, is going to go away as a major political party, those Americans 15 years and under, the majority are non-white. Now, odds are good they're going to turn 18 and still be non-white. And that really is a death sentence for the Republican Party as it's currently constructed. You know, it's fascinating to look here. Since 64, we haven't been able to get African Americans. We made a concerted attempt, President Bush did, to get more Hispanics, and it was very important to him. Got up to about 43%, 42% in 2004. And then it's fallen back to 27% or so. But it's not just Hispanics and Asian and African Americans. If you look at Asian Americans used to support Republicans at like 70%, and now they oppose Republicans at like 70%. So why is that? It's not like Republicans were out attacking Asian Americans, or at least not until recently when Donald Trump started attacking Chinese, as if he had like a list of people to go down that I forgot to attack the Chinese. But they got the joke, I think, that if you weren't white, you really weren't welcome in the Republican Party. And that's really a death signal for a party. That's what happened to the party in California. California was the beating heart of the Republican Party. It was the electoral citadel not that long ago. And now the Republican Party is in third place, not second place, third place. And I think the history of things happening in California and then rolling across the country is pretty good.
I'm wondering also if you could talk about the foreign policy implications here. Nikki Haley spoke last night. She was supposed to, as a former UN ambassador, be able to put the picture of what the Trump administration has done foreign policy-wise. As the rest of the world watches this convention and the language and the rhetoric and the apocalyptic vision that the Republican Party is espousing, what does it do to the standing of the United States in the world and among other political leaders?
You know, what I found just extraordinary about last night and Nikki Haley was, here last week we have Republican Senate Committee under Marco Rubio of Florida puts out a report that says that the Russians were definitely involved in our elections and definitely trying to help Donald Trump. And there was no mention of it. This is the most serious attack on our electoral system by a hostile foreign power in the history of the United States. And we know they're doing it again. And Republicans aren't even talking about it, even when their own party says that it's happening. I find that incredibly anti-American and anti-patriotic. And it's an utter disgrace. The Republican Party that I signed up for, one of the great appeals was that it stood for freedom. When Ronald Reagan said, "Tear down this wall, Mr. Gorbachev," that was powerful. And words had meaning. And the United States did help in the Cold War. And we did help bring a lot of people more into freedom. And now we're on the side of dictators. It's extraordinary. I never would have thought it possible.
Stuart Stevens, you mentioned Ronald Reagan. He launched his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which many felt was a clear signal. This is the place where the three civil rights activists, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, were murdered back in the early 60s. And so I want to go back even further than that to you getting activated in Republican, strategic consulting work, to this very interesting story. You had been, an intern for Thad Cochran. He ran for Senate. He had been a Congress member. You have the period in 1963. You were just a little kid at the time, but Medgar Evers was gunned down in his driveway in Mississippi. You grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and you end up working for a Congress member who you realized the Republican Congress member who was trying to be a Congress member, was white, the Democrat was white, and there was a black independent. Talk about what you did and what you understood well at the time and how that linked into Medgar Evers' murder, particularly his brother, Charles Evers.
Well, it's a fascinating story. When I grew up in Mississippi, there really weren't Republicans. And the Democrats were led by two segregationist senators, John Stennis and Big Jim Eastland. There was one moderate, positive young lawyer who ran for Congress as a Republican, Thad Cochran. And he represented an alternative to that segregationist view. He was the first Republican elected to Congress since Reconstruction. He then ran and I was a page in his office when I was in high school. In 78, he then ran for Senate. And I worked for the guy who had been his chief of staff, who was running for his old congressional seat. So, as you say, my guy was white, the Republican. The Democratic candidate was white, but there was also an African-American independent. And this was really the first race I'd ever done. I've been involved in a volunteer level before. But it became quickly apparent just by looking at numbers that 90% at least of those African-Americans were either going to vote for the Democrat or they were going to vote for the African-American independent. And it was in our best interest that they vote for the African-American independent so that the votes wouldn't go to the Democratic candidate. I mean, it was simple math. So I made a spot. I thought it was very clever at the time, which was like a League of Women Voters voter information spot. It just said, here are the three candidates, and named them. You saw them. You saw that one was African-American. Didn't say anything negative about the African-American candidate. To the contrary, I said he could be the first African-American elected since Reconstruction. But the intent of it was to inform African-American voters that there was an African-American alternative. Now, at the end of the day, my guy won with 51%, so maybe he would have won without. But it was a stark lesson to me that how much our politics is played in the key of race. And that hasn't changed. And I think what we're seeing now...
repeated with Kanye West meeting secretly with Jared Kushner in Colorado as the Republicans try to get Kanye West on presidential ballots across the country.
It's the same strategy. And by the way, that's illegal for Jared Kushner to have done that. And if we had a functional FEC, they would be all over Jared Kushner, and that ought to be investigated. What we're seeing now, and saw last night, is a comfortableness with the Republican Party, a Trump party, with white grievance. I mean, there were two people who spoke at the convention last night that the only reason that they were at the convention is because they waved guns at black people. That's their sole qualification. And this idea that you're going to, these black people are coming into the suburbs to get you white people, is one of the oldest tropes of racist politics in the last 50, 70 years. I think it's misplayed. I don't think that's how the suburbs are. I don't think that most women in the suburbs like to be referred to as suburban housewives, as Donald Trump refers to them. And I take, like, my home state of Mississippi. I'm a seventh-generation Mississippian. We finally took down the state flag, which was basically the Confederate battle flag. It was a powerful moment for a lot of us. And that same week, Donald Trump was defending Confederate flag. So much so, he got on the wrong side of a culture war with NASCAR that's bringing down banning Confederate flags from events. So I think that just indicates the vision that they laid out last night at this convention. I think it's wrong on a lot of levels, but I think it's wrong politically. You take your average teenager in Mississippi, their cultural models are more black rap stars than Robert E. Lee. They don't want to go back to this. And I don't think any of these suburban voters like to think of themselves as being afraid of black people or afraid of those who are different from them. It's a very 1978 kind of Queens divisive view of the world that Donald Trump has.
So, but your book lays out that this is that Trump is the logical extension of where the Republican Party is going, not that he was this hostile takeover that was an outlier who somehow managed to gain control. But what about those mainstream Republicans? You mentioned George Bush, the Bush family, and those Republicans that have still been largely silent throughout this process as the Trump presidency has unfolded.
Look, I think that George Bush believed very passionately in an idea of compassionate conservatism. I know he did. I saw it. For him, this was education. And if you go back and you look at his first major piece of legislation as president, it was signing No Child Left Behind, a bill he signed with Ted Kennedy over his right shoulder. I mean, today that would be presented like at a war crimes tribunal of the Republican Party. That vision of what the party could have become, I think, ended on 9/11 when Bush became a wartime president. So there were these different strains in the party. So if you go back to when first President Bush was president, David Duke became the Republican nominee for the Senate down in Louisiana. President Bush actively worked to beat the Republican who was David Duke. They established a committee of Republicans to beat David Duke. And that was the right thing to do. And the party's just lost that sense of right and wrong as being led by Donald Trump. And one of the lessons I really take from this is how much leaders matter. I think the party could have been led in a different direction. It reminds me of the 1930s. There was a huge fascist element in America. Why didn't America become fascist, like so many countries in Europe? Probably because Roosevelt was president and Lindbergh wasn't. And we would have been the same country. And the same with the Civil Rights Movement. Why was it nonviolent? Probably because Martin Luther King was leading it, instead of, say, Stokely Carmichael had a different vision. So leaders have consequences. I mean, we're taught that in school, and I think we're kind of getting a living lesson of it now.
I wanted to ask you before we break about the significance of Jerry Falwell, who's reportedly resigned, though that was going back and forth, clearly trying to work this out with Liberty University, as president of the Evangelical Christian School in Virginia, amidst the growing fallout over claims about his personal life, put on leave earlier this month after he posted a photo on Instagram in which he's posing with an arm around a young woman holding a drink with his pants unzipped. And then this week, a young man, Giancarlo Granda, a former hotel pool attendant who then became a business partner, said he had an affair with Falwell's wife, Becky. And he said that Falwell would look on as they had sex. Jerry Falwell is a prominent supporter of President Trump and shocked many in the 2016 when he endorsed President Trump over, I think at the time, Ted Cruz was expecting to get that endorsement. Can you talk about the significance of Falwell and his throwing his support to Trump?
Well, look, I think one of the truth that's been revealed here is just the hollowness of much of the evangelical movement by its leadership. I think that there's, 37 million or so evangelicals in America, many of them African-American and Hispanic. So I don't think we can talk about all evangelicals. It was evangelicals who largely defeated Roy Moore in Alabama. They were black evangelicals. But there's been this corruption at the top of the white evangelical movement that's gone on for a very long time. I mean, Jimmy Schweikert, these con men. And Jerry, that's what Falwell is. I could care less about Falwell's personal life. And I actually think most people kind of feel that way. It's just the hypocrisy of it. And it's how do you sustain this when you support Donald Trump? I mean, a guy who's been married 3 times, has 5 kids, very different, who talks in public about having sex with his daughter. It's just who says that he's never asked God for forgiveness because he's never done anything to be forgiven for.
Stuart Stevens, you say black women will determine this next race, who will be president of the United States?
I think so. And the numbers would indicate that, which I think is very hopeful. Donald Trump won with 46.1%. We shouldn't lose sight of this. Mitt Romney lost with 47.2%. African-American turnout went down for the first time in 20 years in 2016 for a lot of reasons, including very active voter suppression. If African-American and non-white turnout can just get back to the levels where it was before and where it was headed, there's really no path for victory for Donald Trump. I think the Biden campaign, which I think is running a very, very good campaign, I think they understand this. I think Senator Harris will help. And it's really, to me, this race is if I was going to focus on one thing, I would focus on the percentage of the total turnout that will be non-white. I think if we knew that number today, we'd know who's going to win this race.
Stuart Stevens, I want to thank you for being with us, veteran Republican political consultant. His new book, just out, It Was All a Lie, How the Republican Party Became Donald Trump. When we come back, we speak with a formerly incarcerated firefighter about the climate-fueled wildfires engulfing California. Stay with us.
All the kids run around playing free and fun while the dogs lap around the camp. Falling down, climbing trees, swimming in the river, no life jacket on their backs. Daughters sharpen the knives and they hunt for food while they watch their children grow. Mothers go into work and they shake the hands of a corporate tycoon's ghost. And I'm afraid, I'm so afraid. What if I lose? Is what I think to myself.
So Afraid by Janelle Monáe. This is Democracy Now!, Breaking with Convention. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we turn to California, where climate-fueled wildfires are engulfing the state. Crews are battling more than 600 fires that have killed at least 7 people. Governor Gavin Newsom said Monday 300 lightning strikes overnight had sparked 10 new fires. The biggest group of fires in Northern California around Napa is now 25% contained. So far this year, 7,000 fires have destroyed 1.4 million acres, compared to 56,000 acres burned at the same time last year. Tens of thousands of firefighters have been deployed across the state to combat the blazes, which are raging as California also battles a record heat wave and the deadly pandemic. This comes as the state's prison firefighter program, which annually deploys thousands of incarcerated firefighters to the front lines for just $1 an hour, faces diminished numbers because of the coronavirus pandemic. Last month, Governor Newsom ordered the release of some 8,000 incarcerated people, including some from the prison fire camps, as COVID-19 swept through the state's prisons and camps. Several fire camps faced COVID outbreaks in July. Now, as advocates demand mass release for incarcerated people at risk due to the pandemic, more than 1,300 incarcerated firefighters are currently fighting the blazes ravaging California. One of the state's 44 prison camps, the fire prison camps, Delta Conservation Camp in Northern California, is battling the fires with a crew of 55 incarcerated firefighters compared to the camp's 132-person capacity. Over the weekend, Democracy Now! Reached former incarcerated firefighter Marty Vinson by phone. He was stationed at Delta Camp in 2018, where Democracy Now! First met him. In an interview, Vinson called the prison firefighting program California's piggy bank and spoke out about the conditions firefighters at Delta Conservation Camp are currently facing.
I imagine the worst. I honestly do. I feel like I can imagine them working much longer hours. So we normally do 24 on, 24 off. I can imagine them doing anywhere, because it's possible. You can do a 48 to 72 hours. It's just so many things that go on out there, regardless if it's natural things that can kill you, or let alone a human being that's making a decision that can possibly kill you. But I believe this is probably the worst conditions, and the firefighters are probably going through their worst experience ever.
That's Marty Vinson, formerly incarcerated firefighter. To see our whole interview with him at Delta Conservation Camp, go to democracynow.org. The prisoner firefighter shortage has laid bare California's reliance on prison labor to keep its ever-growing wildfire season at bay, an exploitive system many have called slave labor. California saves up to $100 million a year by using prison labor to fight its biggest environmental problem. And once released, it's nearly impossible for formerly incarcerated firefighters to get jobs with county or city fire departments in California. For more, we go to Oakland, where we're joined by activist and formerly incarcerated firefighter Rashid Lockhart. He's a firefighter at San Quentin State Prison. He was released in January. He's an organizer with the group Planting Justice in Oakland. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Rashid. It's great to have you with us. Can you talk about what's happening right now? California's talking about a firefighter shortage because prisoner firefighters, a number of them have been released due to COVID or are sick with COVID. Explain what's going on and the fact that they make $1 an hour if they're healthy enough to fight the fires.
Yeah, so these conditions, they're implorable. I mean, you have, I believe it's 600 less firefighters this year, and we're facing some of the largest wildfires that we've ever had in this state. These guys are out 24, 48 hours at a time. That young man came from Delta Camp. That camp, I just talked to somebody there, and they're leaving at 5 o'clock in the morning, not getting back till 8 o'clock at night, and this is every day. So they're being overworked. Therefore, $1 an hour. I mean, they're working alongside firefighters that aren't incarcerated people that are making, we don't know how much, and putting their lives on the lines. And it's just, it's a little bit of a human tragedy. They're battling COVID-19 and they're battling wildfires at the same time.
Rashid, I wanted to ask you about Kamala Harris, so the nominee of the Democratic Party for vice president. When she was Attorney General of California, she advocated against early release programs for incarcerated people because it would reduce the number of incarcerated firefighters. Could you talk about her role in this whole issue of the politics of how to deal with the incarcerated and the fighting of fires in California?
Yeah, well, the fact is it impacts our state economy, right? They're saving $100 million a year on having formerly incarcerated individuals fighting these fires. And it's a little bit of a slap in the face to those of us who are incarcerated, who are trying to, be the best that we can be and put our lives on the lines to go out here and fight these fires. But, her doing that and being a part of mass incarceration as, the district attorney, she essentially is signing people up for slavery, right? You want these guys to go out and fight these fires and do it for only $1 an hour. And then you're turning around and saying, oh, we don't want to release anybody because, it's going to cost the state this much. It's implorable.
came out, and later when she became senator, she said that it was her prosecutors who argued this in court. She said she thought it was reprehensible, not at the time. She says she didn't know about it, but said the buck stops with her, and so she took responsibility. It's unclear if she knew about it. But this whole issue of firefighters like you come out of prison, you're extremely experienced. CAL FIRE sings your praises because you're doing the most difficult work, yet you find it so difficult to then to become a firefighter. Like right now, for the many people who are released, even perhaps early because of the COVID pandemic, why don't they just immediately hire you, since you have the experience, you fought these fires, at CAL FIRE salaries? Not to mention giving more money to the prisoner firefighters.
Yeah, that's the question, right? I mean, you take, like myself, I was a lead engineer on a Type 1 fire engine and a lead on the ambulance crew. I don't know what more qualification you would need, right? That should automatically entitle me to go right into a department upon my release, but that's just not the case. They, for like me being more of a municipal firefighter, they want us to have EMT certifications, and state law right now currently blocks me from getting that.
Because you were formerly in prison?
Because I was formerly in prison, yes. And if right now, like, we're hearing CAL FIRE get on these interviews and say that we just lack resources. Well, what they're not saying is we lack the incarcerated firefighters. That's the issue, right? Because we make up the backbone of the firefighting department. And if we're saving the state $100 million, how much more can we save the state by taking formerly incarcerated people coming out of these fire camps, coming out of these firehouses, and putting them right into employment?
I'm wondering, when you were out there fighting these fires, to what degree did you encounter National Guard troops? Because I've been surprised time and again at how few National Guard are mobilized when these fires spread in California.
Well, I myself am not qualified to answer that because I was at an actual functioning firehouse. I wasn't at a camp, so I didn't get to go out to the wildland firefighters. I instead was resigned to the city of San Quentin, the quote-unquote city of San Quentin, and where they had a full residency around there. And so I was doing basically municipal firefighting.
And can you talk about what you did when you were in prison, or what you've heard people are doing, for example, at San Quentin with the COVID outbreak? I mean, you have one of the worst outbreaks in this country, is in the prison system of this country, right. San Quentin at its heart.
Yeah, so what people are doing right now, and what I'm hearing, is they're essentially just sheltering in fear, right? The conditions are not, they're not, San Quentin is not designed to have an outbreak like COVID-19. It's impossible to practice social distancing. It's overcrowded, and then people are being herded off into tents and back into gymnasiums that, I don't know if you remember, about 5-10 years ago, there was, an outcry about the way they were housing people in these gymnasiums. And so San Quentin is just not set up for this type of outbreak. And so my incarcerated people that are still there are sheltering in place. My fire crew that's there at San Quentin, they're getting more calls than they can handle. I talked to one of my incarcerated firefighters who had said that morning, it was only 11 a.m. in the morning, that they had been on 5 calls. But they had only been on 5 calls that morning because they couldn't get to the other 11 that were happening. So it's a human tragedy what's happening in San Quentin, and the incarcerated people that are there are living in fear.
Well, Rashid Lockhart, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Rashid worked as an incarcerated firefighter at San Quentin State Prison, was released in January, now an organizer with Planting Justice in Oakland. And this update in the police shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin, of Jacob Blake, an unarmed 39-year-old black man. Blake's father says his son is now paralyzed from the waist down. Protests continue there and across the country. Blake's father will also speak at the virtual March on Washington, D.C. this weekend, along with other family members. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Happy birthday to Julie Crosby and Vesta Godars.